that our attendance might be low, but we thought it was important that we go on and have it anyway, because we're going to have one other. And that one will be a summary of all the ones that we've had in the past. So maybe when folks leave some of their events tonight, they'll come over. We won't keep you here until midnight, somewhere between now and midnight. No, not at all. My name is Henry Baskins. I'm the Executive Director of the Community Relations Council, and this is number 3 of a 4-part series of race relations in. We've had race relations in education, race relations in the economy, and tonight is race relations in politics. The 4th will be held on the 31st of August. As I said, that one will be a compilation of all the things that came up in the discussions that we've had in the past, as well as throwing in, and that word that causes a lot of angst lately is symbolism. So that one will be about symbolism as well as a summary and unanswered questions from the past 3. Tonight I am very, very thankful to have our panelists here with us, and I will ask you to introduce yourself to our audience, starting with Mr. Stevenson.
Thank you, Henry. I'm Hal Stevenson. I'm a local businessman. I have a billboard company called Grace Outdoor. I'm also on the board of the Community Relations Council, and I'm glad to be here.
Thank you.
Reggie Lloyd, practicing attorney, private practice in Camden and a little bit all over the state. Thanks for having me.
All right, I'm very loud, I don't need this. I'm Paul White, I'm a political science professor at USC, a researcher of race and politics.
I'm Joe Neal, member of the South Carolina House of Representatives, District 70.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Todd Watts. During the day, I work as a political consultant. During the evening time, in my free time, I'm a neighborhood president and current president of Neighborhoods USA. Very excited and happy to be here today.
Well, thank you very much for being here. Let's start with the heart of the matter. Recently, I was reading a comment that, to me, sort of summarized a lot of what we have been going through in race relations. And the author was an economist from the 1700s. And his summary was that what he saw was that I need your help to get my crop in. You need my help to get your crop in. But I don't trust you, and you don't trust me, so therefore I won't help you, and you won't help me, and we both fail. That was something that was very interesting to me. The philosopher and economist is Paul Hume, who said he was a Scottish philosopher and economist. And I see that in the discussions that we've been having lately on race relations, that lends to the phrase distrust, racial distrust. So I want to open it up with that question. Do you see racial distrust between black, browns, and whites? Or is that just perception? How?
Well, certainly I think there's distrust. I was born in 1959, so I've come through an era of really unprecedented merging, if you will, of races through public schools and coming together. And so I grew up with white and black, and the Hispanic community was not large at that time. There were fights, there were, misconceptions and other kinds of things that went on until you started playing basketball or football or doing some sort of extracurricular activity, and then you began starting to trust people because you got to know them. So I think part of the problem has been that we have not taken the time to really know each other generally in our society, though it's changed a great deal from when I was a kid to now, and I think this is just further part of that process where if we can empathize with each other, that's when you learn to trust each other. So I do think it exists, but I think it is much less than it's been in the past.
Reggie?
I agree with what Al just said. I think it's interesting though. I have a 13-year-old, and we've sort of anointed the millennials and those younger as post-racial. And there are a number of studies that I've seen in the last couple of years that would suggest that on some level they certainly are. They're certainly in a more diverse environment generally than even what I grew up in. But that there's still a lot of latent mistrust or latent hostility towards different races or ethnicities that would suggest that there's still a deeper problem there. And I think that's something we've got to really address on the front end in terms of stereotypes and perceptions that people hold in their homes and in their communities when they're around like people. And so, yes, there's distrust. I think there's, on some levels, as Al said, we're making some progress. What I still do find disturbing is that group that we would expect less of this from may still hold many of the same attitudes that we did and their parents did.
Professor White.
That's a very good question, very good quote, by the way. There were a lot of different, I guess, implications to that quote. I would say we have a pretty turbulent racial past from an institutional standpoint. So when we're looking to try to move past that and kind of converge races in the sense of, equity in politics, we try to put labels on these various, you could label them black issues, education, prison industrial complex. And I feel like in the post-racial, as Brother Lloyd said, we are a post-racial society. The nature of equality, a lot of empirical studies show that people don't think about race very much. But then when the political season comes around, pundits come out, political blowhards, and they actually understand the power that race you can acquire. You can acquire voting share, you can acquire a lot of actual support from a monetary standpoint from various organizations. So I feel like we're in this very interesting transitional period as far as race is concerned. But I'm an optimist, so I feel like we're going to be all right.
Representative Neal.
I found that question to be an interesting question as well. From my perspective as a elected official, as particularly someone who was born in 1950 and watched much of what we went through as a state in the period of desegregation, I've seen a lot of change on the surface in terms of the social interaction of people of different races in this state. We're now able to go almost anywhere you want to go that your dollar will take you. But it's the dollar that right now kind of defines your access to goods and services. However, I think there is still a growing body of evidence that suggests that racism no longer is a in-your-face social force, but rather has become an institutional force. Racism is institutionalized in many of the institutions of our society that disadvantage poor people and people of color. So the dialogue isn't just about those surface relationships that we have, the social lubricants that keep us functioning as a society right now generally don't allow for that kind of friction without a lot of social condemnation. What is allowed is the actions taken institutionally against poor people and people of color that we seem unable to address or even recognize.
Thank you. Ty.
I'm just shaking my head in total agreement with Representative Neal because to me, the answer to this question is, I'd like to take it on two levels. One is the political level, obviously. We see it all the time. In Washington, the total dysfunction is people don't trust one another. We see it sometimes on our local level, even, I won't name any particular city councils, but I'll let you fill in the blanks, where this person doesn't trust this person, and this person feels like they're always trying to veto my plan. So we see that happen a lot. And I do think that there is still some perceived racial issues, and and that there are some legitimate ones, particularly when it comes to voter ID laws. From a community, let me answer that from a community standpoint, I see that a lot with different neighborhood boards and different national organizations where when you see large board of directors come together maybe 3 times a year, and those that aren't as active as others, sometimes it's easy to pull that trigger a little bit when it didn't need to be pulled. Or sometimes the trigger is pulled because nobody else has pulled it because it has been going on. So really, it affects us in every single way, but at the core, whether it's from a political answer or a community answer, it's, we as a society are all in this together. And, what is good for you can be good for me, but we've got to work together to lift each other up, because if we don't, we're just going to pull each other down.
Thank you. We're going to get into some of the meat and potatoes issue. You brought up, well, before we do that, I'd like to turn to Professor White. Professor White gathered some statistics for us, and I'd like for you to highlight some of the more outstanding ones, the one that caught your attention about race relations in politics, or African Americans, Hispanics in politics, and the overall population.
Okay. So I recently ran an experiment in South Carolina on election day. It was an exit poll. So I took a variety of racism measures. There's a lot of ways in the academic community that people decide to measure racism. So it's like you can measure with a variety of survey questions, whether they be directly asking you how you feel about black people versus how do you feel about these stereotypes. There's a lot of ways in which people try to grasp this idea of racism. It's not the old-fashioned overt racism. It's this new idea of, racial resentment, or symbolic racism. There's a lot of, it goes under that moniker. So what I decided to do was, as we know, there's been this serious infusion of conservative black candidates. So I'm evaluating, how the white electorate is viewing these black candidates. So one would naturally think conservatives, as we all know, the history of politics, conservatives and the racism element have always been kind of coincided. But with this new infusion of conservative black candidates coming to the forefront, gaining serious success, all white electorates are superseding white elected officials for these African American conservatives. So what I did was I looked at Tim Scott. Tim Scott, polling wise, has got overwhelming support in South Carolina on all fronts, whether it be from his policy standpoints to his party platform. So when you look at his approval ratings, they were very high. They were higher than Lindsey Graham's. So in the context of South Carolina, I'm like, okay, we have these 2 conservative senators, both of them being polled individually, running against different Democrats. So they obviously, being in the state we're in, they're gonna have very high approval ratings. So, like I said, Tim Scott's approval ratings were 10 points higher than Lindsey Graham's. So intuitively, one would think, if I was to vote for either of these candidates, Tim Scott would get more support in the state of South Carolina. So basically, the survey that I set up asked everyone who was exiting the voting booth, who did you vote for? Did you vote for Tim Scott? Did you vote for Lindsey Graham? Did you vote for, Nikki Haley? And if you supported all 3 of those, you were pulled inside of this sample. So what this sample did was it said, in a hypothetical race between these 2 candidates, which one would you support? So what this did was this got rid of partisanship. As we all know, partisanship's really strong right now. It's very polarized. Our government's never been this polarized from a party standpoint. We have a new enclave of the Republican Party, the Tea Party, that has a serious presence in our, political process nationally. So when you're trying to figure out, okay, where does racism play in this? How are race relations affecting how people's processes are as far as who am I going to vote for? How is race affecting that decision? A lot of people say race is not affecting that decision. People say I'm just a conservative. If there happen to be some racial implications to my conservatism, so be it. South Carolina, I'm born and raised here. I was born in the 80s in Irmo, and we've always operated under our own set of rules, even within the southern, region. So I'm looking at I'm looking at all of the populations in South Carolina. So we put out polling in Oconee County, Greenville County, here in Richland and Lexington County, and down in Charleston. So what I was trying to do was get people in a comfortable context after they voted to see who would you vote for and then measuring their levels of racism. And the interesting part I found was that overwhelming support was given to Tim Scott. Overwhelming support was given to Lindsey Graham. The poll was reflective of the actual election returns, but the interesting part was when you pitted them against each other, and I used those who had the highest levels of, this perceived measure of racism, it predicted at like an 80% confidence level that they would vote for Lindsey Graham and not Tim Scott. So for us to understand exactly how race is playing in our contemporary politics, we have to kind of look past the partisanship. And then when you're looking at a specific policy standpoint and what people are doing as far as what is a black issue, what is a white issue, how can I perceive someone white as being prejudiced because of their political stances, it's very ambiguous. And like, as a standard voter in the electorate, I'm very latent. It's like, you go to this, a normal voter, whether they be white or black, and you ask them a variety of questions, they're gonna get offended, they're gonna, it brings up a lot of emotions when you talk about race. So that was the most interesting finding, but anecdotally, like 3 of my workers got assaulted by, people who were taking the actual survey. So I kind of systematically put the racial measures within them, and it went from like, do you agree, or they were all agree, disagree questions. So the interesting part was when they got to the last one, which spoke of generations of slavery, like it was one of the strongest and overt racial questions. That was the moment in which the racial stimuli went into overload. And I made sure all of my administrators of the polls were white. I made sure everyone, so that you would be in the most comfortable context. And you find that people just don't want to talk about race. It's very difficult, it's very uncomfortable, especially in a conservative state like South Carolina. So I think for us to have positive inroads into, like you said, working as one, it seems like we just need to talk. It's a very uncomfortable talk. Like when I present my research, I even see it getting uncomfortable on a national, like just on a population standpoint. And I find if we're going to address this together in talking about race, it's just a matter of just candor. Like people self-monitor a lot, they don't feel comfortable. A lot of the white participants that I interviewed intimately, it's like they're genuinely on the scale, they're very low on their levels of racism, but they're still not comfortable talking about it because of how our political environment has basically staged your stance on racism. It's either you're racist or you're not, regardless of how you feel or your personal interaction with blacks on a day-to-day basis. If you take a stance on a policy, that will imply whether you're racist or not. So I would say in summary, the most interesting finding was just the level of, and this was on black and white side. Like I got a lot of pushback from my community saying, why are you asking these invasive questions? I was like, these questions were made in like the 70s. Like, I didn't make them up, I just picked them. So it's very interesting approaching this from an academic standpoint, just seeing the pushback you get just because people are uncomfortable. Black people are uncomfortable, white people are uncomfortable. It's very, if approached the wrong way, it can just get really ugly fast. So
What I'm hearing you saying is that we don't know how to have positive conversation around the race issue, so we retreat. We don't have the conversation at all.
very much so.
Okay. Well, let's stir something that will make you uncomfortable. The voter ID. Voter ID. There are people who've said to me, Caucasians who've said to me, I don't know what all the hoopla is about. We need, you have to have IDs for other things. Why do you need to bring this up now? Why should anybody feel that, well, we're taking something away from them because we're asking them to show an ID? On the other hand, I hear, well, what they're trying to do is limit our access to the polls where we can choose the candidate that has our point of view. So now, I'm going to start with Joe Neal. Tell me about, Representative Neal, about voter ID, and why do you find it offensive that the position that some have taken is that everyone needs to have this particular ID to vote, not just your registration card, but a voter ID?
Well, first let me give a little history.
Okay.
This whole voter ID movement began with an organization called ALEC. ALEC is an organization that is an extremely conservative organization whose job it is to develop legislation that promotes the conservative agenda in any way possible. And it is an organization that speaks to legislators in all 50 states. So what we found was this legislation was introduced simultaneously across the country, but particularly in areas that had high African-American voter numbers, populations. It was designed to be a barrier to voting. In South Carolina, that bill initially meant that tens of thousands of African-American voters would have a difficult time voting under the terms that were laid out under the bill that passed the South Carolina legislature.
Can you explain the terms for us so we'll know why that would have been a hamper?
In order to vote under that bill, one had to produce a photo ID. That photo ID had to be one that is produced by the state of South Carolina. It would not accept a student ID, would not accept any other non-state issued ID. In order to get a state ID, one had to produce a birth certificate. For many in the African American community, particularly in the elderly population, many were born at a time and in a place where birth certificates were not issued to people of color when they were born, which meant that they were at a disadvantage from the start. How do you get an ID if you can't produce a birth certificate? As a result, tens of thousands of African Americans in our community found themselves in a position where they were in danger of not being able to vote again, because they were not going to be able to produce a photo ID issued by the state of South Carolina. And in fact, the courts agreed. And as such, the state amended its voter ID bill to allow for a looser form of this voter ID requirement. Today, individuals can get a photo ID from their voter registration office without a birth certificate. And as a result, we've been able to kind of sidestep the impact of the intention of that bill. Where we are today is simply in a place where it is clear that that effort was part of a larger effort to restrict the political power of people of color in South Carolina. It was a ploy. And the response that you heard, that you gave earlier, well, you have to have an ID to board a plane, or you have to have an ID to do thus and so. Well, those are privileges. You should not have to produce a voter ID for your rights. And particularly in an environment like this one, where the rights of people of color for generations were denied, particularly the right to vote. You know, it was interesting to note how the courts in Washington have moved against the Voting Rights Act. I see that as part and parcel of that same mentality, making it as difficult as possible for minority communities to have access to the polls, particularly in an environment where states are moving to restrict access to the polls. Here in South Carolina, we shortened the days that one can vote in advance of an election. We in many cases eliminated what we call early voting, or restricted it severely. We've done a number of things that prior to the court's ruling would have required the state to go to the federal government, to the Justice Department for pre-approval. But now that Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act is no longer in effect, these states now feel that they have an ability to do these kinds of things, and we're seeing more and more of it.
Well, we're going to go on the opposite side. Professor White, did you have?
Yeah, I was just going to add on to what the representative was saying. Specifically, when you're looking at Voting Rights Act, you definitely, like what he was saying, is very poignant in the sense of the historical nature and evolution of this. We're in a two-party system. So when you're thinking about both parties just as rational actors, they're going to do whatever they can to get as many votes as they can and lessen the amount of votes in the other party. So these tactics can be racial or non-racial. The point is to get votes and to attain political power. As the brother said, there's always been a specific target towards African Americans in the United States. But now that these walls were actually deterred by civil rights legislation and a variety of state and local measures, Section 5 was removed. So when you think about the things that could be, you know, detrimental to this, there's empirical studies that show voting IDs, shortening actual voting centers being open in about 2 hours takes away up to 10 to 20% of the voting activity. People getting off work. There's always a strategic nature to what we're talking about as far as accessibility to political participation. And on the opposite end, you think of like, so there's, in Australia, it's called compulsory participation, where you get fined if you don't vote. So it's like,